you guys doing?
Good. Very good.
Yeah. I like how you're color coordinated today. Looks great.
It's most days. I had an alternative, but it didn't really translate well to the screen. I'm going to show you. Yeah. So maybe you'll disagree, but should I put this on?
Yeah, I think a lot of times we always get accused of wearing the same thing. It won't be the same style, more t-shirt, collared shirt, but
we wear okay.
It's really conducive to the climate we want to live.
All right, guys, this is very exciting because that's actually the first time for us that we're doing two partners together. I'm glad this is happening. Also, we haven't interviewed anybody from the New Orleans yet. So it is exciting for that as well, to try and get in your perspective. What I want to do is either one of you can start with this. If you could share like your individual paths to becoming partners. Like now you have your firm, but before that, Peter, I know you started practicing in 2004. Mm-hmm. So if you could very quickly take us through a gist of passing out of college and then what led you up to where you are here, and Colin will go with you next.
Okay, great. Yeah, so, I'm born and raised in New Orleans, went to LSU for architecture school, graduated in 2004, moved back to New Orleans, in the summer of 2004, started working at Manning Architects. I had done a summer internship with them the summer before, so knew most of the people there. They had some interesting projects, that they were working on. So starting there in June, and worked through, went through the intern phase of being there, and just kind of kept working through projects, doing different things, and kind of moved up, got my license. And eventually, when I was about to leave, I'd become a senior associate about a year or two before. So, went from being an intern to managing some other groups of people on projects. And then in 2016 is when I left to start Good with Colin.
Yeah, absolutely nothing happened in New Orleans around 2000.
I was trying to get the quick version. We can go into deeper stories, if needed.
Yeah, and then I was in Michigan for my undergraduate work. It's where I grew up. I finished at the University of Michigan in 2008. That was a tough time to try to enter the workforce. So immediately went to grad school. Only looked at places in warm weather climates, and the school at Tulane here in New Orleans, in the city itself, was just beyond compare to everything else I looked at. So moved down here, entered grad school, finished that in 2010, and then kind of hopped around a wide variety of positions. Things weren't a whole lot better economically here, but started out working, kind of freelance with an architect here called Build. Worked a little bit with neighborhood housing services on some affordable housing prototypes, and then kind of got my foot in the door with a group who was doing a lot of work in the lower 9th Ward post-Katrina, Make It Right. And I worked there for about a year, and then kind of build things in with things like movie jobs, and then finally, right as I was taking my first position in an architecture office, was offered a project management position for a developer. I was building high-end hospitality projects around the country. And that's how I met Peter. And so actually the first full-time job I've had in an architecture office was my architecture office right now. Right.
So when I was doing my homework yesterday on you guys, Colin, I read about the fact that you actually conceptualized the idea of having goat during your graduate school. With that, what my question was to that was, when you said you came up with the concept, oftentimes when you talk about a firm, people talk about a business plan. They talk about mission. How does it that those two things tie for you when you said concept? What do you mean by that?
So it even started earlier than that. I was reminded when we were in DC by a friend I hadn't seen in a while. So I was coming up in the height of the the bizarre acronym architecture for names, right? So, and it, the Bjarke Ingels group and the fashion architecture taste and all of that, and joked around about this idea of naming a firm tongue in cheek, after the greatest of all time acronym. And then, working in grad school, I had a project where we had to develop a business plan and some branding for our practice. And that came back up again, more or less tongue in cheek. But that was that very initial seed of an idea. And then while freelancing after moving on from grad school, the ideas started to germinate a little bit, and it was, that's when, it became more than just an acronym for greatest of all time. The Global Office of Architecture and Taste was kind of born as an idea. And it was about being aspirational in how we would start from the beginning. And then there's a lot of components that then went into it. But then when meeting Peter and starting to talk about the idea of a practice, it was in the background, but was never necessarily the plan to start a practice with that name. It was more, we had a real connection in terms of what our priorities were. One of which being, we wanted the office to be aspirational, and also we're adamant that wasn't our names.
Yeah, and I think so, to jump in, to carry that into where we were. So, as we started to, do some things and we started to do a few small projects, on the side. And we were using, Goat Studio as the name when Colin and I started to really look at, okay, we're gonna take this full time. One of the first thoughts was, well, will we use the Goat name as the firm name, or will it be something else? And yeah, like Colin said, we both were, completely in agreement that it wasn't going to be firm names. We weren't trying to do something that was about the two of us. It's about something bigger. So there was some back and forth, and I talked to a few, people that I had worked long-term with, clients, a few friends, because I just wanted to get a sense of, would it sound, is the tongue in cheek almost too much? Is it, does it go too far? And what everyone said, and it was really great. They're like, the name, it's fun. It's, it sticks there, you remember it. It's also about the work that you do. And so, the firm can be named anything. You could have a great name, but if you do terrible work and you just don't have the right profile as a firm, it doesn't matter. So I think, that was one of the first times, and maybe we didn't see it, when we approach any project, we do this full review of it. Is this the right fit? Is this, what should we do? So that was really the first time we did that with the name. And from there, it stuck. And I'll say that people remember it. People remember Goat. It's easy. It's not last names. It's not. I did a firm review at AIA last year when it was in San Francisco. The comment back was, "What a great name, because it's not 3 letters. There's a lot of 3-letter names. That's really good. It sticks. People know it." So I think probably one of the first decisions that we really, I wouldn't say go back and forth, but we had, completely just went through and decided about it. And it was a great decision. I think, it's part of what makes us a great firm. Get everything on that?
Yeah.
Right. And so, Peter, if you could just give me the timeline. So correct me if I'm wrong. So Colin, you chip in here as well. You came up with the concept in your graduate school, which was just a name that you came up while you were there. Peter and you meet at work. At a certain stage, you decide you want to start your firm. I actually have a question here while I'm saying this. Did you guys both individually always have a motivation to start your own firm? Is that something, a bigger picture that you had in mind, or was that something one of you did, the other one needed convincing on to get on the board? How did that dynamic work before we come into the name bit of it again?
Gotcha. And I think it almost, those can almost be answered for me at least, at the same time. I would say that right out of school, I didn't want to necessarily own a firm. But I did always want to be in a role where I would be at a level where I can make some of the decisions, affect the decisions of the firm, manage the people, there enough that, and I used to always tell people, I don't necessarily need my name on the door, but I want to be at the table where the decisions are made. I think that evolved over time. And this kind of comes in where I met Colin. So they said we were working on a large project, entertainment project in Baton Rouge. We were the architect of record with another design firm out of Las Vegas. During construction, since it was such a large project, someone needed to be from the architect's office on site. It was actually something I always wanted to do, even in school. It just seemed really fun to be able to have that cross between construction and design. So I jumped at the opportunity to go out there for a year. When I got there and I had an office in a trailer, Colin's office was across the hall in the trailer. So, we were probably two of the younger people there. So I think just because of that, we, kind of started to become friends, talked a lot of things, talked about what our aspirations were. And that was 2011, 2012. As that project wrapped up, we were still working on some projects together. We used to actually have a project that was about a 6-hour drive, maybe 5 each way. And so we would just talk back and forth, talk about ideas of architecture. And a lot of it was, how can architecture be better? Like, a lot of people have a lot of complaints about architecture and design, and, it doesn't make enough money. It's not a great profession. And I refused to accept that there was no way to make architecture an incredible business model. And, Colin had a lot of the same ideas. And I think we kept pushing each other, doing some working together, talking about architecture, talking about design, talking about these concepts of how it can be different. And I think it just got to the point, 2015 or so, where it was like, all right, we can't keep just talking about this. Like, let's do it. We had written a business plan. We had, mission statement, all these things. And I was like, let's do it. We've been talking about it. We think that we know how to do this. So let's make it happen. And so that was in, meeting Colin and talking through that. That's when I made that transition from, I don't want to just manage a firm. Like, I want to be the person, the principal, the co-founder. Again, that's, at least for me, that's kind of where it went.
Yeah, and then my answer will be much shorter.
Yeah, sorry.
and less measured and sane. I was 100% convinced from undergrad on that my path was going to be running a practice and owning a practice, and I had very little interest in working in other practices. And I don't recommend that necessarily as a career path, because, I came across this book when I was in grad school that listed the start date of all these famous practices and the age of the founding principles at the time of starting, and, flipped through it and set this milestone date of this obscenely young age that I needed to be starting a practice. And that led me maybe to skip some steps that might have been helpful. But at the same time, I think it allowed me to not have these bad habits that can tend to be built over time working in other practices, and come to things completely fresh. So one of the constant interactions between Peter and I, and one of the reasons we work really well, is he has this long professional background. He understands what the standards of the business are, everything down to, title block standards and why we use these scales on these views. And I'm coming to it completely fresh. and questioning everything and wondering why anything needs to be that way. And I think in isolation, either of us, that's a less interesting practice in Peter's case, and it's a less successful practice in my case. But coming together and questioning things, but having a deep understanding of standards and why they are the way they are, I think has kind of laid a groundwork for us that's been really successful. And then I kind of lost the thread of the rest of the question.
I think, yeah, you got it. I mean, that's where, you know, on our titles of the website, when I'm the voice of reason and you're the I can't even
the idealist, something idealist, I forget the word. I think it's the adamant idealist of that. So actually kind of pressing on just that, guys, what you just spoke about. You do identify as the idealist. He does as the voice of reason. When you guys came together, this was 8 years ago that you founded Code. It's been 8 years since you're working together as partners. My question would be, as of now, 8 years down the line, what does it mean to you in context of your firm to be like call each other partners? Like, what does that nature of the relationship at work look like? And another thing I'd like to press on, like, what are the key factors when considering like that you had when you do a partnership with somebody? I know it grew very organically in the case of two of you, but did you have certain sitting down back in your room before you met Colin, if you thought you were going to start your partner, what are the things characteristics you wanted in your partner?
and I want to jump in on that one.
Oh, okay.
I'd like both of you to speak.
No, you will, but
go ahead. Whoever wants to go first.
When you were saying it, I was thinking. So I think honestly, I didn't know that to start, and even when I met Colin, and you know, I could tell, like, you know, just how he thought and how he was. It was like, I don't know, like, is this the exact right person? But what I tell people now when they ask this question is like, if Colin and I were the same person, it would never work. Like, either way, it can't. You can't have two of the exact same people. You also can't be so far apart that you're just arguing about everything. I think one of the things that really makes this successful and it makes the whole firm successful is that we're both questioning each other, but it comes from like there's mutual respect. Like, I respect everything that Colin knows and what the things that he can do better than any person I've met, like, and that I know maybe I can't do those as well. And I know that, you know, he probably would say feels the same way. So when we're deep in a conversation about, you know, who knows what, if it's a design or a detail, it's always about this respect that we both know that we're coming from two different places on it, but where we're going to arrive is going to be this just incredible, you know, if it's a design or if it's running the business, just because it's two different opinions, and you know, and it kind of meets up and creates this really great thing. And so yeah, I didn't know when we started, you know, what the perfect person was, you know, as a partner, but I think it's pretty easy to describe now that you want to be, you know, just enough apart that you can both push each other.
Yeah, I 100% did not know even that I wanted a partner, but the type of person I was looking for. But now that we've been doing this a little while, I think the piece of advice that I give whenever anybody asks me about starting a practice is, if feasible, find a partner that you can disagree with constructively, but checks the boxes. Be honest with yourself about your weaknesses. You know, for example, you know, throughout COVID, there was just a lot of paperwork that we needed to do to survive, you know, applying for grants and subsidies and loans. And if it were just me, or if it were a partner that was just like me, we wouldn't have made it through that tough stretch. Peter checks boxes that I know I don't. And that's a very, very small example. And I think if you're able to be honest with yourself about what your weaknesses are as well as your strengths, then that will lead you to the best partnership ideas. And then, you know, I think as how this has evolved, I think the foundation is 100% still there. You know, we're still small enough that we're both working on just about every project in some capacity, but we've become much more of a team and understanding, what the strengths and weaknesses are. And I think as we've grown, that's starting to evolve into a little bit more defined roles. I think that approach of everybody working on everything is starting to evolve into being more consistent project to project, that Peter's bringing a wealth of experience and knowledge on the detailing side, on the execution, on understanding construction means and methods and things like that. And then, I think my strengths lie a little bit more on the schematic and conceptual side. And then ensuring that one another are involved even in the phases that aren't necessarily aligned with that phase. So, Peter bringing me in on meetings on the construction site when needed, I think is kind of key to our success, not just taking it for granted that is Peter's strength, so Peter's going to do that. Peter acknowledging that even though my strengths lie earlier in the project, that I have some insight to provide, later, and vice versa, involving Peter in charrettes and everything else like that.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely, that design process. And that's one of the things that I'll always, I'm always excited about when we get into that process, because it's always so much better just because of the way that the two of us work.
Right. That was lovely. In fact, you guys already touched upon my next question, where I was going to kind of press on how do you divide responsibilities within the firm. I think both Colin and Peter, you did touch upon that. If we were to put it a little more structurally, like I know, Colin, you mentioned that you come in the first half, is the standard sort of convention and more in the first half of a project. Peter takes on the second. How did you even come up with that process? Like, is that an understanding between the two of you that you said? Is it a lot more fluid? How do you divide responsibilities?
I think it's it's evolved naturally over time, and I think that's kind of where it's headed, is that type of division. But there's no steadfast rule that's the way it is. There are plenty of projects that Peter has managed from the outset and all the way through construction, and myself as well. I think the thing that is remained steadfast throughout is that none of it's ever in a vacuum. Like, there's no such thing as this is Colin's project or this is Peter's project. That we are lending our talents to whatever portion of it, regardless of which of us is managing the project. And then I think as things have gotten larger and more complicated, and it just necessitates a little bit more of a division of labor, that's where this divide between phases has started to emerge, rather than this project seems like it's a better fit for Peter versus this project's a better fit for me. It's started to become, we're working on everything together, but I'm much more leading the design team in the early phases. And then I'd say we both have more or less an equal hand in most projects during the documents phase. And then when things move into construction, I guess there's always exceptions, but then that becomes a bit more of Peter's responsibility than mine.
Well, I think also one thing is we both are very involved in the proposal phase.
Yeah.
So meeting, after, getting to the point of, client reaching out about the project, we are, one of us is always going to kind of take the lead on who writes the proposal, but it's definitely, one person does it and then, sends it over, review it, like, let's look at, fees, hours, those type of things. Because it's very much both of us. And I think one of the, to go back to your question about how did those roles develop, I think it's like Colin said, like, realizing that everyone has strengths and weaknesses, or even just strengths and better strengths. Like, some people are just better suited to different phases of the project. And I think one of the things that's really important, and it's important to me, and also, for everyone that works for us and will work for us, is that you at least are asked if you would want to be involved in a phase. So yeah, there are projects that Colin is mostly managing design, but I'm going to come in, I'm going to sit in the meeting, I'm going to give some feedback, I'm going to talk about it. That's on most of the time, that's fine for me. And even with our employees, if someone is saying, yeah, I don't want to be very design focused for right now, I always say, let us know if that changes over time, because what we never want someone to do is to be upset because one time they said they didn't have time for a design charrette and then they never got included again. And now all they feel like they do is draw documents. So when we talk with everybody, it's always, look, people want to work on different things at different times and we have our strengths and weaknesses, but everyone's going to have an ability to somehow be involved in the projects. Because it's important. I mean, it's big for retention, it's big for culture, it's big for just people wanting to be here and wanting to be excited about the project, just to have a buy-in, even if your only part of that project was a 1 hour charrette at the beginning and then getting the walk one time during CA, like at least you feel like you know what that project is. So that's to me, that's critical. Now that will never change. Regardless of where we go through the years.
Yeah. So in this case, guys, I'm going to play a little bit of a devil's advocate here in ways that you guys have built your rapport together. Left to the room, I think you understand what ticks you off, what you like, what you don't. You understand each other's energies. But when you interact with, say, a new contractor or a new client, there can be different perspectives that you have on what they're proposing or communicating to you. Do you guys have a process in that situation where you have an agreed upon term that we do not, something as simple as commit right then and have a discussion date? Is there any such thing when interacting with a new personality in the space and you guys have to take a call? An external stakeholder mostly.
We have a series of kicks and nudges to direct the conversation.
Always under a table? The meeting has to happen while there's a table, okay?
No,
We should.
I think it's a challenge that we're still at. I think early on, it was relatively easy. We would get excited about the project, and we were also in a mode where we weren't saying no to a lot. So the risks of one of us stepping in it was a little bit less, but we were taking every meeting together. We were introducing ourselves to clients and contractors together and kind of presenting a unified front. As we've gotten busier and more projects have presented themselves, that's harder and harder to do. And I think the need for a little bit more of a process is probably there, that we do need a little bit of refinement on that. But at the same time, we know each other so well that I think Peter knows pretty quickly in a conversation with a client that this is not going to be a good fit for our team. And I would agree. So, and same thing here, that I might get really excited about somebody who is really ambitious design wise, but doesn't have experience or doesn't have a real budget or doesn't have these other things. And as soon as those things start to become clear, it might not temper my excitement, but I know it would Peter's. And I think as long as we're, this is the partnership, that is going to be the approach. But everything we do with this eye towards how is it going to work when it's not just us? It goes back to that initial conception of Go not being just about us. It's about something bigger.
I mean, I think also we've spent a lot of time together, man. At this point, I feel like even if I'm talking to someone, I'm thinking, oh, this is probably what Colin would be saying right now. And I'm sure, same thing. And there's also in some ways it's not as hard as it seems, because there's clients and project types that are just going to be things that, Colin is just going to take the lead on and things that I am. So we kind of know, obviously depending on project size, we'd both be there if it's something that, I can just go do this. But I think, after 8 years, officially in business and a few years before that, like I feel like we almost know what the other person would be thinking when it comes to those. And we're also then we come back to the office like this is what I'm thinking. This is what I feel about this project. I'm excited about it, or maybe I'm a little in doubt about it. And then we talk through it. But,
And like any relationship, it's never 100% correct. Like we're frequently surprising each other, I think, in terms of what actually piques our interests or what frustrates us. But that next phase of getting the team to fully embrace that process as well is the next adventure for sure. Yeah.
Very exciting. All right. So going back to the name, guys, like GOAT is the acronym, which stands for Global Office of Architecture and Taste. I am very intrigued about the taste half of it. I have heard architecture, yes, within an architecture firm's name. Could you speak to that a little? Why is your firm called what it is?
Well, yeah, I think one of the founding principles for me, going back well before the company, is that architecture and design suffer when they're too isolated or too inwardly focused. And the taste is really about us believing that we are credible voices, not just in the world of architecture and design, but that we should be polymaths. We should have opinions about art. We should have opinions about music. We should be exposing ourselves to those things. And we live in a place where those things are in an incredible abundance. And I think we're evolving and growing in terms of how that manifests for the company. We do things like there's music playing in our studio all the time. Actually, this is probably the quietest it's ever been. We debate new albums every week, and we have heated arguments, less about design and much more about Drake versus Kendrick Lamar. And actually, no one disputed that Kendrick Lamar won. But that idea that architecture needs to be pulling from everywhere to be really successful, and we strive, and we don't always hit the mark, but we really want to be tastemakers.
Right.
We want to be on the forefront of what the culture and what the zeitgeist is thinking about, and then trying to encourage the team to not just isolate themselves on their headphones in the corner on their computer, but to engage with the wider world. And I think that makes us better designers for our clients.
Well, I think it goes to, we don't think, and you mentioned a little bit, we don't think of architecture as just this like, oh, it's a building, it's some walls, like, and then the interior design is something else, and the landscape is something else, and that's all design. And that's, to us, it's foundational. You can't take one piece out of it. So we expect everyone to kind of think like that. It's always funny, especially when we go to maybe bigger conferences or stuff, and people want to say, well, do you just do architecture, or do design, or interiors? And it's like, no. And they'll say like, well, which one of you does the architecture, and which one does the design? It's like, why does it matter? Like, we are a design firm. We do great designs. And that leads into the tastemaker part. Like, you can't take that out. There is no taking the art and music and all those things that are part of what we do. You can't just take that out and just do architecture. It's all goes hand in hand. And we probably would love to do more of the tastemaking. I think the one that we've really pushed is on the music. Pushing that out every year. Our top albums. But that's not the only thing we talk about. Like Colin said, we're talking about sneakers and just anything related to cool art, fashion, music, and it's enjoyable, and it gives you a chance to kind of talk about something else other than buildings all the time.
Yeah, and architecture is very much sensory. It's and there's all all of these things that happen in and around our work, whether it's the band on Canal Street playing outside of a project, or it's the food the chef is making in the restaurant we designed. And it seems completely insane for an architect to not have an opinion on those things and not let that opinion inform their work. And I think that's the root of the taste. It's architecture first and foremost, and then maybe edit this part out. It also works really well in the acronym. There's not another. I couldn't come up with an RT.
But for sure, guys, I think I can second this. I think I spent 2 hours. Would I set aside 2 hours before an episode for me to prep and dig out whatever I can on the person's website and online. When I went onto the website, when I started doing the process, I did see Colin's playlist and I put it on play while I was doing that for 2 hours. So this was the most fun prep for me. And whatever you guys just spoke about is so well encapsulated in your website. And thank you for making my prep time a lot of fun.
Awesome.
Your website, yeah. So going on to the next question with this is also the physical space itself for GOAT. I know you guys mentioned you've joined the shop workspace. That's where it's located. It also talks about you guys being founding members of the company. If you could speak to a little to that relationship. One, why did you choose sort of a co-working space as your firm? Was that a conscious decision? Did the funding come in first? How did that work?
To be clear, we're not founding members of the shop.
Yeah.
Okay.
But we initially started out of a home office, just Peter and I, working together, and we had looked at a few places around the city. Peter's previous job was in a high-rise office, with a more or less kind of corporate, clean desk type atmosphere. My experience was maybe the entire opposite. I was either in construction trailers on site in the messiest possible situations, or I was, my experience was studio in school. And that was much more the environment that we were looking for. And, I think the overall plan eventually is to develop our own space with the shop and things like that. But, there's some economic realities when you're starting. And we toured this place during an event in New Orleans called Entrepreneur Week. It was still under construction. It's designed by, some incredibly talented, well-respected architects that we won't name here because they're competitors. I'm just kidding. It's EDR. And the aesthetics of the space, the feeling was really remarkable. And then it kind of dawned on us that, especially as we start to add team members, that environment of just, sitting next to Peter and I, or just seeing the same 2 or 3 or 4 people every day is not necessarily the most conducive to creativity, especially when we start talking about things like being polymaths and being exposed to other industries and ideas. And that's built in to the co-working model. So we're, I'm looking across the hall at a credit lending institution that started up in the city. And, we're surrounded by tech startups and other designers. Some of our engineering consultants are in the same space. And that environment has been really, really fruitful for us, and to the point that we've stayed here much longer than we initially conceptualized.
And have moved around, from a 2-person to a 3-person to a 4-person.
Yeah,
2 offices.
2 offices, and it's starting to become a little bit unwieldy, but that environment where we are surrounded by people doing other things and talking about their business, and when you're a startup, you tend to be really passionate about the thing that you're working on, and being around that energy, I think, is really, really helpful. And then it's also led to some relationships in terms of projects, and it's been really beneficial. I think the ultimate plan is to still develop our own space, but and we kind of keep inching it back as we think about things like, who's going to be in charge of replacing the printer toner, which we don't have to worry about now.
Yeah, and really, this space is great. I mean, I came from a firm that was larger, near 25 to 30 people. That year that Colin and I spent working at my home office was tough for a lot of reasons, but one of them it was just the two of us. There wasn't that other people around. And when we got here, even though it was still just the two of us in a small office, you'd walk out and you'd see 30 other people, and you might not necessarily know their names or be friends with them, but just having that interaction of seeing other people. And I think it's this almost goes to kind of post-COVID world, something that people miss, that interaction, even if you're not talking to people on a daily basis, just like seeing people and seeing other people do their work and eat lunch and all the things that, kind of make us human is nice to be around. So
we also ate way too much deli meat when we were working at
Yes.
It's a very strategic location. Right?
Yeah.
We needed more lunch options.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. And my next question, guys. So in terms of New Orleans, the city itself, I know you guys bring it up, and it's kind of, you again touched upon it. It kind of defines how you guys see yourself as polymaths. For both of you, what stands out for me from the very beginning, I think, Peter, when I met you in person, I remember asking you a question as to what was the most difficult thing for you to do professionally. And you spoke about sticking it out at New Orleans, even when things were tough. Growing from that, I also see you are the president of the New Orleans chapter of AIA. Colin, you are the co-chair of the small firm exchange in New Orleans. So you guys are pretty much embedded in the ecosystem of New Orleans. How do you see that having shaped the culture of your firm and your leadership style uniquely from whatever you see? You just come back from the conference, you meet different kinds of architects. But what is it that shapes your style of leadership in it?
I think, and I'll jump in since you said that. I just kind of ran over a few years of some hard times. And I think we did, touch on it when I spoke at a conference, graduated in 2004, Hurricane Katrina in 2005, and how, tough that was. Everyone in our office, some of us were in Las Vegas, some of us were in Baton Rouge, some of us were in New York, some people were, I'll say, working remotely. Working remotely in 2005 was a little bit different than today. But those things, they were really hard, and they were, it was a lot of fear about what would happen and how would we get back, as a city, as a business for the firm I worked for. But it was also just, the connections that you make when things are really difficult, and, the people that and the friends that you lean on, and your family that you lean on. And especially that happening at, 25, so, generally out of school, call it a youngish age, it affects you, it kind of changes who you are, and it makes you, you see when you see other people struggle, or you see challenges people go through, you can kind of, put it back to challenges that you've gone through. And I think you're also more willing to help people because you remember, the people that helped, if it was, monetarily, or for even just like kind words or other things. So that definitely, kind of shaped who we were. And I lost my train of thought there.
Well, yeah,
so go
and
forward.
Obviously, Katrina's etched in everybody's memories around the world, but New Orleans is also just, it's a very unique place. That there are challenges day to day that carry through in living in a city, that is small, that is climatically very, very hot for a lot of the year. I just ran to a construction site and back before this meeting, and I thought I was going to have to shower. And then it's a city that we're kind of constantly being told is under threat, and it has a lot of reputational challenges. But all of all of that said, it's also just an incredibly culturally rich city. There's something that is really wonderful about living in a place that's a little bit of a challenge, because it means if you're still there, you really want to be there. And I think that carries through for us in our attachment to the city. That, one of the questions we ask during interviews is often, what are your favorite parts of the city? What are your attachments to the city? Do you see yourself being here for a long time? Because it has this reputation as a city that you visit, and it's really nice to have fun in, but making a life here is hard. But in our experience, the life that we've made here is so much better for all the challenges that the city has. And I think we've built a team of similarly minded people about the city of New Orleans. I think the challenge moving forward is, there's another word in the acronym, that global. And because New Orleans is such a unique and one-off experience, I think we're starting to realize that, there may be some challenges as we work outside of the city and familiarize ourselves with other cultures. And when we were in DC, remarking on, wow, how is it possible that they all have really flat cobbles or, paver lined sidewalks? Everything that in our city is not like that. And I think that's part of the road ahead is, it is an ambition of ours to do work all over the world, but we are also very, very appreciative and understanding that the unique characteristics of a place should inform the work. So the challenge of, how do you be global? How do you spread your creativity around the world while still granting the level of respect and interest in the place where your work is, that we've always applied to our work in New Orleans is a unique challenge. I don't know that we have a good answer yet for. But
no, I don't think we have a good answer, but I think like a lot of things, knowing that that's something that's important, knowing how fiercely, we defend the culture of New Orleans makes us realize that every place has that, and they should all be honored. Every city. So I think when you say,
not every place.
All right. When you say, how do you do that? I don't know that we know how to do that, but the recognition that we have to is that first step of making sure that you aren't just coming into a place and saying, oh yeah, I think I know that city. This is what they like. We, make those decisions reality based. And I think one other thing I was going to say about New Orleans is, how it affects us and how it's shaped, professionally. And it's a more concrete example is, we're a pretty small city, metro area. We don't have a lot of open land. So a lot of the projects are renovations. A lot of the project types aren't the, large, giant, greenfield sites that maybe you'd see in some of the other larger cities around the country. So I think that what that's taught me in my professional development and everyone else's, we're working in older buildings, or even if we're doing new buildings, they're close to other infrastructure, other things, or, they have odd shaped lots, and you're doing these things that are kind of tough. And, as you're working through these challenges, it makes you a better designer. You're either going to, rise to the occasion or you won't. And, we always will. So it's that part of the city, I think, makes the people who live and work here a little better, because, it's not the easiest place, but I don't think I'd want to live in a place that was always so easy. Everything was easy. That's just not a reality. But
yeah, and I think maybe, thinking out loud, and this just dawning on me in the moment, is that maybe the way forward to branch out and touch those other places around the world is, to use that as the through line. Like, I think I've always had an affection for cities that are a little rougher around the edges, cities that don't hide their challenges, but they're a little bit more upfront and in the open, and everyone is addressing them as a community rather than brushing them under the rug. So I think about places that like say Detroit or cities around the country. Not all of the challenges that New Orleans faces are 100% unique, and I think there probably is a lot of opportunity out there to lend our perspective coming from a city like New Orleans to those other places, as long as we are always mindful and respectful of the fact that they have developed their own culture, and there are people there who understand it better than we do.
Yeah.
That should be deferred to.
Yeah, it's very interesting that you even bring up Detroit, Colin, and I second what I think Peter said. The fact that you guys are cognizant of New Orleans holding the culture it does and kind of recognizing, yes, there are challenges, is very apparent in the way you guys approach it. And when you bring up Detroit, Colin, I think of from whatever interviews I've done and interacted, I do feel a strong sense of community coming in from Chicago and Detroit. Similarly, the second one that I was kind of introduced to was through you guys with New Orleans and the people and the work you do. It's very informed by the city. Yeah. Very quickly, moving on to my next question in terms of, I think you did touch upon it again, Colin, in the past, but having been through the pandemic, having been through the challenges you had associated with being in New Orleans, how has your partnership, I know you mentioned Peter in terms of doing the paperwork with the pandemic and all of that work through, really channeled in. How does that help, having a partner, as opposed to say if you were a solo firm owner? During these sort of tough times, because architecture firms are cyclic in nature. How does that, yeah.
I think one thing I would say, and then I'll, just as a small point to that. So the having a partner, I think, is the most critical thing you could do with a firm, because Colin and I are on the same level. We're both co-founders, we're both principals. We own an equal part of the company. We can talk to each other about things that you wouldn't be able to talk to someone else at the firm about. And so you're not siloed. You can, if you have these fears because we're in the middle of a global pandemic and you don't know what the firm's going to be like, we can share those with each other because we're on the same level. And I think that's, having a partnership allows you to kind of bounce those ideas off. There's nothing I can't talk about related to the company with him because he knows everything that's about the company. So we're able to bounce those ideas. And I think you can share some frustrations and you can, vent a little bit, let that, get out, and then you feel better about it. And I think we do that often, and it's always, it's a good healthy thing to do. But
yeah, and I think that's well put. I think the thing that the pandemic really did for me was cement that was the best model for us in perpetuity. Mm-hmm. That Peter was the right fit, because it's natural, I think, to wonder during some of the challenges, whether you could do this on your own, or whether if I had full creative control over this thing, would it be better or would it be worse? But this work is so much more than creative control and creativity. And I think I actually told Peter this the other day, that the moment I knew that this was going to go as long as we wanted it to go was when we were approved for a piece of funding through his work that had almost nothing to do with me, but that extended our financial runway to the end. When I realized that type of thing is always going to be available to us because of the partnership, it cemented for me that this is the path forward. And I think a running theme of this conversation is okay, well, what does that mean as we grow? Hopefully outlives us. and hopefully it evolves and adds to us. And that I think that challenge of ensuring that there's always a balance, but that we can add to the leadership structure and bring in additional principals and partners, raising up the people who are already working for us to that, I think is a really, really exciting challenge because of how much those hardships proved the model. And I think the more voices that are truly committed to the ideals of the company that we can add and raise up to that same level equal to us, the longer this runway is going to be, and we'll be able to keep going.
Yeah. And it's funny when excuse me, when Colin says that, because and this will probably go back to the commentary in the last question, maybe from being around some disasters and things that are really tough, I didn't think anything of that. So COVID comes, it's horrible, we're all working from home, we have to make these tough decisions, it's scary, we're a little panicked, but then pretty instantaneously the part takes over that says, yes, but what do we do? What do we have to do to get through this? What are the things that we need to do to make sure that we survive, our families survive, that the people who work for us, that they're taken care of, and that the business survives? And I think that sounds easy to say, no, you should do that if you're in the middle of a disaster. But it's kind of ingrained into my mind once that initial shock of everything going on started to wane a little bit. The next thing that I thought was, okay, what are we going to do? Because we can't just sit here and let this destroy, what we built. And we're going to be safe. We're going to make sure that we follow every recommendation, and we're going to take care of all of our people. But what are we going to do, and how are we going to do it? And so, so SBA, all these things, reaching out and filing paperwork. How do you do this? It just kind of like that light flips, and it's like, we got to go. We got to keep doing this. And so
I'm going to be the interviewer for a second. Do you think your experience seeing another firm navigate something like that during Katrina helped?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Because you see what it takes to survive, right? As a firm, like, that, there's things that are uncomfortable. There's going to be moments where, finances go down, but if what you plan to do is survive through that event, then you make the list, you call the people you have to call, you fill out the paperwork, even if it's not fun, you do it. You take on the projects that, we mostly do commercial work and some residential. We took on a lot more residential work during COVID because that's what was there. You take on the work that's going to help you survive. And then once things return to normal, you kind of pull back from that, and you work back to what you were doing before. But you have to be aware of what's going on. But if you have a plan, and if you have a desire that I want to be doing this for the rest of my life, and I want it to extend past me, you're going to hit road bumps. There's going to be market downturns. There's going to be disasters. There's going to be things that nobody wants to talk about. They're going to happen long term, and you just got to be prepared for them. And then when you aren't prepared for them, you do what you can do.
Yeah, shout out to Ray Manning for making you who you are.
Yeah, a lot of people, honestly, that we worked through during that tough time at Manning.
Right, that was a great question, Colin and Peter.
Thank you. We might start.
So just the last one, guys, for you guys, I think if you could run through one of each. So for the listeners who are listening, if they're at a juncture where they're looking to start their own firm, if you could give us one piece of advice and one sort of word of caution that you think before you start your own firm that you should be mindful of. You're 8 years into it, and your experience would be, I think, quite valuable in this case. So go ahead with whoever wants to go first.
You go first?
Yeah, sure.
I already mentioned find somebody who checks boxes that you don't, and be honest with yourself. I think if it hasn't come across, hopefully it does. I think the biggest pitfall that people run into is taking themselves and the work a little bit too seriously. It's a serious profession. We have there's a lot of money that is involved in the work that we do. There's a lot of, lives are very much at stake. And with that in mind, it's very easily done where you start to overthink things. You start to take yourself very, very seriously. And I think it's important that you take your work seriously, but don't take yourself too seriously. When you name your company, don't overthink it. I think that's what has kind of helped us build a foundation and a culture that is different from other practices. Is that, this is a serious profession and the job warrants serious attention. That doesn't mean you have to take yourself and your brand and the environment that you're in so seriously that it becomes stifled.
Yeah, and I would say that the piece of advice is that it's going to take a little bit to get the ball rolling, to really start moving. I think that what you have to do is obviously you have to have a plan for at least what you want to be, maybe in the next 2 to 3 years. I think you have to trust that plan's going to work. I mean, you have to be realistic with what the projects you're going to have starting at. And if you're leaving a firm and maybe you're taking a few clients with you, or if you're just going straight out, like that work more than likely won't be the work that you're doing in 4 or 5 years, but there's an incremental process to that. You do one work, one project for a client, maybe it's not the best project, but you hope that the next thing that you do and the next thing and the next thing, and you're building upon it, and you're kind of trusting the process that you're going to get there. But it's tough. And then, I think also remember that, even if it's clients that you work with, or if it's somebody that's a long-term, like your time frame isn't their time frame. And sometimes you can get really nervous because you're like, things just aren't coming in. And that is nerve-wracking. But, the people are going, if you're doing your job correctly, if you're reaching out to people, if you're talking to them, they're going to come around. They're going to most people want to give other people an opportunity. They want to see, new people in the profession. They want to see growth. So I think it's just, you just got to trust it and keep working on it. And then I know you said one, but the other thing is, get involved in, things like AIA and other groups in the city, volunteer for boards and committees in the city. Like, you meet other people, and some of them, you think, oh, why do I need to meet a bunch of other architects? Well, architects have projects that don't fit what they're doing, or maybe they're busy. They give, people, if you're serving on committees, you're meeting developers, you're meeting people who are coming before you. And if nothing else, it's just letting you get comfortable talking to people, because if you start a firm, you are going to have to talk to a lot of people. Like, it's the nature of the business. You're going to have to talk, and they're going to, maybe not want to listen to you, but the more involved that you can get, I think there's so many things that we could point to, if we said, how do we get this project, or how do we get this opportunity, that kind of boils down to these little small interactions that Colin and I had that have just grown and grown and grown until they become these bigger things that kind of run the company.
Right. Since Peter took two, I'm going to give one more quick one. So I gave this to a friend of mine the other day. The time to do the planning for when you have a team and you get large is when you're on your own and by yourself. Early on, even before you start the practice, it's going to feel silly to make a handbook for all your employees with with HR policies. But the time to do that is not after you have a team of employees. Mm-hmm. So the more groundwork you can lay, imagining yourself as the firm that you want to be in 5 or 10 years, mm-hmm. the better off you're going to be early on, and you'll be happy that you have that in place as soon as you realize that you really need it.
Yeah, good second.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you. But I do feel it's a missed opportunity if I don't ask you guys this. And I almost feel like you guys inspired me to do this. I'll probably do it on every episode. Would you have one recommendation for a restaurant in New Orleans that you like?
Oh my God.
That I would have to visit. Your website did this to me. What is the one place that you would?
That's like the hardest thing.
This is the hardest question of the interview, babe.
It is the hardest. Like you said, wow. Yeah, this is the one thing that we haven't just been like, oh.
All right. All right. So the thing that surprised me most about the food in New Orleans is not how great New Orleans cuisine is. So Creole and Cajun food. It was how good everything else is for such a small city. So I'm going to shout out a guy that is absolutely incredible and has been one of my favorite places since I first moved here, and that's Stein's Deli on Magazine Street. It's the absolute best pastrami that I've ever had in my entire life. And yes, I have been to New York. It is, but hands down, it stands up anywhere. And I think it's indicative of how far that appreciation of food in New Orleans extends. It doesn't just go to the po' boy shops and the gumbo. It's all the way to, to the traditional deli.
Yeah, and that's why the question's hard to answer, because like even if you boiled it down to like what's your favorite restaurant in a neighborhood or a type, it would still be like, well, there's this and that. I'm gonna say Paladar just because it's
from San Francisco.
Doesn't matter. They're in the Orleans. It's okay.
His favorite in New Orleans, yeah. That kind
of. No, I mean, look, once you're here, it's New Orleans. It's not. Maybe everyone that's from here might not have that thought, but my take on it is if you're here and you're cooking food in New Orleans, that's New Orleans food, because just like everything we've been saying, the influences around you every day are going to change you. Even if you were a chef in San Francisco and you come here, you're not cooking the same way. I firmly believe that. But yeah, that would be my pick for best restaurant.
Interesting.
Thank you.
Flower moon bagels. Turkey in the bowl for sandwiches. Porgy for fresh seafood. The Surrey's for breakfast.
Now we're gonna
Molly's Rise and Shine. See, this is the problem.
All right. Thank you so much, guys. You really bring out the best of each other when in the same frame. So thank you so much for doing this together today. Yeah,
thank you very much.
Yeah.
And hopefully everyone is as exuberant when you ask them about their favorite restaurant.
I hope so.
We got or wherever else.
You guys have set the benchmark high, but let's hope that goes in. Have a lovely day.